The moment Hermione Granger's consciousness snapped back into place, she was somewhere between the magic of Platform 9 and 3/4 and the rhythmic clatter of a northbound train. One moment, she had been 19 years old. She had been standing in the wreckage of the Great Hall, her lungs full of smoke and blood and ancient dust, her hands still trembling from the last spell she'd cast. Fred Weasley's body lay beside her on the cold stone floor. Remus Lupin and Infedora Tonks were arranged nearby with the terrible stillness of people who would never move again. Dobby's grave existed somewhere in her memory, a headstone she had helped Harry carve with shaking hands on a Devon beach, the sound of the sea utterly indifferent to what they had lost. The next moment, she was small. Her teeth were too large for her face. Her hair pressed against the fabric of a train seat in an enormous cloud of brown curls. The hands resting in her lap, hands that had gripped a wand through 7 years of escalating violence, were the soft, unmarked hands of a child who had never cast a spell in anger. Her wand itself, 10 3/4 inches of vinewood and dragon heartstring with a core that matched her unyielding nature, lay across her knees and felt deeply, fundamentally wrong, familiar in the way a photograph of someone you loved felt familiar, recognizable but missing something essential: the warmth, the weight of history. The train compartment was empty. She was alone. That was the first mercy of the day. Hermione sat completely still for exactly 45 seconds. This was not shock. She had experienced shock. Shock was the feeling of watching someone die in front of you before your mind had any framework to process it. This was something else entirely. It was assessment. Her mind, trained through years of crisis management and impossible situations, was already cataloguing the facts of her circumstance with the efficiency of someone who understood that panic was a luxury reserved for people with no plan. She was on the Hogwarts Express. It was September the 1st, 1991. She was 11 years old, and her body knew it in ways her mind found deeply disorienting. She could feel the difference immediately. The way her magical core sat shallow and undeveloped compared to the deep resonant channels she had spent 7 years forging through practice and necessity. She knew the theory behind the Prothean charm. She knew non-verbal casting. She knew how to produce a Patronus under conditions that would have broken most adult wizards. She had a working understanding of apparition, advanced legilimency defenses, and the precise conditions required to produce fiend fire without incinerating herself along with her target. Her body could execute almost none of these things. An 11-year-old's magical core lacked the developed channels for high-level spellwork. Attempting advanced combat magic would risk magical exhaustion, backfire, or worse. She was not a weapon yet, not in any conventional sense. She was something considerably more dangerous. She was informed. Hermione pressed 2 fingers to her temple with the clinical precision of someone taking her own pulse. The trauma she carried wasn't metaphorical. It lived in her nervous system like a second skeleton, shaping the way she breathed and the way she flinched and the way her hands sometimes shook for no reason she could explain to anyone around her. Bellatrix Lestrange's Cruciator's curse had carved itself into her muscle memory. The phantom weight of the Horcrux locket hung around an invisible neck, weeks of starvation and frozen forests compressed into a ghost sensation she would carry for the rest of her life. She could still hear Ron screaming her name from the cellar at Malfoy Manor, the sound of it hitting the stone walls and bouncing back, distorted, like something from a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Her body would flood with cortisol it couldn't process. Her hands would shake, and she wouldn't be able to explain why to anyone. She was the emotional architecture of a war veteran, compressed into the neurochemistry of a child who had not yet experienced her first year of school. She had approximately 30 minutes before the train reached its midpoint. She needed to find Harry Potter. Hermione allowed herself precisely 90 seconds of grief. She thought about Fred's face caught mid-laugh in a corridor she would never watch collapse. She thought about Remus Lupin. Who in this timeline was alive right now, alive and alone and poor, isolated in a world that considered his condition a moral failing, believing his closest friends had betrayed each other. She thought about Dobby, who was enslaved at Malfoy Manor at this very moment, tending the grounds of a family that owned him, not knowing that freedom was something that could belong to him too. She thought about Cedric Diggory, who was currently 14 years old, who had done absolutely nothing wrong, who would be dead in 4 years if she failed. 90 seconds. Then she stopped, because Hermione Granger was above all else a strategist. Grief, however deserved, however necessary, was not strategic. Not yet. Not here. She would do her grieving in pieces, in the small hours when no one was watching, in bathrooms and empty corridors. She would carry it the way she had learned to carry everything, quietly and without showing the seams. She reached into the school bag at her feet and withdrew a piece of parchment. She'd packed the bag herself. Weeks ago, a lifetime ago, in a bedroom in Crawley that she had left for the final time this morning, her parents waving proudly from the platform, entirely unaware that the daughter they were sending to school had already survived a war they would never know existed. She picked up a quill. She began to write the must-save registry. The list came quickly because she had been composing it in her head since the moment she had oriented herself. Every name was a person she had watched die. Every name was a reason she was sitting on this train rather than standing in the ruins of what the Great Hall had been. Sirius Black, currently rotting in Azkaban for a crime he had not committed, imprisoned without trial by a ministry official who had been in too much of a hurry to investigate properly. He had been there for 10 years already, and would remain for 2 more in the timeline she remembered, emerging gaunt and hollowed and half-mad from Dementor exposure, before dying at Bellatrix's hand in the summer of 1996. The man who should have raised Harry Potter had instead spent a decade in a prison designed to strip its inmates of every happy memory they had ever owned. Surveyable. Peter Pettigrew was on this train right now. The path to Sirius's freedom ran directly through a sleeping rat in a boy's jacket pocket. Remus Lupin, 31 years old, living alone somewhere in Britain, because the wizarding world had decided that werewolves were subhuman and employment was therefore optional. Believing his best friend was a murderer, would die on the 2nd of May, 1998, in the Battle of Hogwarts alongside his wife, leaving their infant son an orphan who would never know either of his parents' faces outside of photographs. Savable, contingent on Sirius's freedom and the prevention of the war. Fred Weasley, 13 years old, sitting somewhere on this train right now with his twin brother George, almost certainly planning something that would give Professor McGonagall a headache before the end of the first week. Would die on the 2nd of May, 1998, mid-laugh, in a corridor explosion. The image of George sitting beside his twin's body was one of the memories Hermione had long since decided she would never fully recover from. Savable. If the war never happened, Dobby, enslaved at Malfoy Manor, would die in March of 1998 with a silver knife in his chest on a beach in Devon, saying Harry's name. The mechanism of his freedom in the original timeline was complicated, tied to a scheme involving Lucius Malfoy's diary that Hermione intended to intercept entirely. Cedric Diggory, 14 years old, a Hufflepuff prefect who had done absolutely nothing wrong, who possessed the specific decency of someone who had never had a reason to be unkind, would be murdered on the 24th of June, 1995, because Voldemort had said, "Kill the spare," with the casual indifference of someone dismissing a minor inconvenience. Savable, if Voldemort never returned to a body. She paused. The list could keep going. Colin Creevey, Lavender Brown, 50 people in the Battle of Hogwarts alone. Every single person who had died in both Wizarding Wars was alive right now, in 1991, alive and unaware and completely unprepared for what was gathering itself in the dark forests of Albania. If Voldemort never returned to a body, none of them had to die. The entire war could be prevented. That was the mission. Not individual names on a list. Not small victories and tactical retreats. The complete dismantling of Voldemort's immortality architecture before he ever had the chance to use it. Before he could leverage the infrastructure of his own survival against a world that didn't know how thoroughly he had prepared for death. Hermione folded the parchment carefully and tucked it into her bag. Then she stood up, straightened her robes, and went to find Harry Potter. The train corridor was crowded with first years hauling trunks and peering through compartment windows with the wide-eyed expression of children encountering something genuinely new. Hermione moved through them with the focused efficiency of someone who had navigated considerably worse conditions and knew exactly where she was going. She found Harry's compartment two-thirds of the way down the train. The door was slightly ajar. Through the gap, she could see a thin boy with untidy black hair and glasses that were a size too large for his face, sitting across from a red-haired boy with a spray of freckles across his nose. A rat sat on the red-haired boy's knee, apparently asleep, its grey fur rising and falling with a suspicious regularity that Hermione filed carefully away. The rat. She stopped in the corridor and made herself breathe. Peter Pettigrew was 3 feet away from her, the man who had betrayed James and Lily Potter to Voldemort. The man who had murdered 12 muggles with a single curse and cut off his own finger to frame an innocent man. The man who would willingly cut off his own hand in a graveyard in 1995 to resurrect the darkest wizard of the century, if she allowed that graveyard to exist. He was asleep in Ron Weasley's jacket pocket. She could not grab the rat. She was 11 years old with an undeveloped magical core. The animagus reversal spell, the blue-white flash she had watched Lupin and Sirius use in the Shrieking Shack in third year, was beyond anything her body could currently execute. Even if she somehow managed it, she had no proof, no credibility, and no adult ally who would believe a first-year muggle-born who had grabbed another student's pet and attempted to force it to transform. She had to be strategic. Hermione composed her expression into something that was not the battle-hardened assessment of a 19-year-old war veteran, slid open the compartment door, and sat down. "Hello," she said. "Do you mind? Everywhere else seems to be full." Harry looked up. His eyes were green, startlingly, unsettlingly green. Lily's eyes in James's face, and in them Hermione saw something she recognized immediately, something that had nothing to do with magical ability or prophecy. He was a child who had never had a friend. Every interaction he'd known outside the walls of his cupboard had been either neglect or deliberate cruelty, and he had the careful stillness of someone who didn't quite believe that kindness was a real reliable thing. She knew him, loved him actually, in the way you loved people you had fought beside and bled for and nearly died with. But he didn't know her yet, and she couldn't let any of that show. "Of course," Harry said. "I'm Harry. Harry Potter." "I'm Hermione Granger," she said, and watched Ron's eyes go wide at the name. She did not look at the rat. She made a deliberate effort not to look at the rat. "Is that a real owl?" she asked instead, gesturing to Hedwig's cage. "She's beautiful." Harry's face transformed when he looked at the snowy owl, something lighting up in it that hadn't been there a moment ago. "Yeah, I just got her. She's called Hedwig." "That's from A History of Magic," Hermione said, and then stopped herself. In the original timeline, she would have launched into an enthusiastic recitation of everything she'd absorbed about Hogwarts, demonstrating her knowledge like armor against the fear of not being accepted. She had spent years understanding that impulse for what it was, a child who had always been strange among her peers, performing intelligence as a substitute for connection. She wasn't going to do that. She knew where that path led. She knew Ron's eventual opinion of her. She knew that she had spent the entire first half of first year quietly, persistently lonely, while trying far too hard. "That's a really good name," she said instead. "Did you choose it yourself?" Harry blinked, clearly recalibrating for a conversation that hadn't gone the direction he'd expected. Yeah, I'm Ron Weasley, the red-haired boy offered, fractionally less suspicious of her than he might otherwise have been, mostly because she had just complimented his new friend's owl-naming abilities. Nice to meet you, Hermione said. She looked at the rat on his knee, casually, with the studied nonchalance of someone whose heartbeat had not just spiked. How old is he? Ron shrugged. Scabbers. He was Percy's before Percy got an owl. He's been in the family for ages, actually. How long, would you say? I don't know. 12 years, maybe. My mum would know. 12 years, Hermione repeated, keeping her voice entirely level. That's impressive. Common garden rats usually only live about 3 years. Even magical ones don't typically make it past 10. Ron looked at Scabbers with a new, slightly suspicious attention. I never thought about it. I read about it somewhere, Hermione said, in a book on magical creatures. She reached into her bag and produced the chocolate frogs she'd bought on the platform. Do you want one? I bought too many. The conversation shifted naturally to chocolate frogs and famous wizard cards, to the Hogwarts houses they'd been sorted into, to what they each expected and feared about the year ahead. Hermione led it gently, asking questions and listening to the answers with the specific quality of attention that comes from genuinely caring about the people you're talking to. She had planted the seed about Scabbers' impossible age. That was enough for now. She had months before she needed to act on Pettigrew, and she needed to plant considerably more seeds before she moved on any of them. She needed to become Harry's first real friend, alongside Ron, not instead of him. She needed to do it genuinely, because she did genuinely care about him. But proximity was also strategy. She needed to be close enough to Harry to protect him, to manage what was coming, to be the person he turned to when everything went wrong. Are you nervous? Harry asked her, and she realized he'd been watching her face. A little, she said, which was such a vast understatement that she nearly laughed. Me too, he admitted. Then, carefully, like someone testing whether the ground would hold, I didn't know anything about magic until a month ago. I'm probably going to be rubbish at everything. I doubt that, Hermione said. She meant it. She had watched Harry Potter cast a Patronus at 13 under conditions that would have broken adult wizards. She had watched him survive a killing curse twice. She had watched him face Voldemort 6 separate times and refuse to be destroyed. I think you'll be fine. Harry looked at her with the careful hope of a child who had not yet learnt to trust that good things were allowed to be real. You think so? Hmm. As the train moved north and the landscape shifted from city to countryside, Hermione let herself think about the problem she couldn't solve yet. The scar. Harry Potter carried a fragment of Voldemort's soul in the lightning bolt scar on his forehead. This was the Horcrux that had never been named until the very end of the war. The one Dumbledore had known about and kept secret for years, orchestrating events around it with the careful precision of someone playing a very long game with someone else's life as the piece on the board. In the original timeline, the Scar Horcrux had been destroyed by a precise confluence of circumstances that could not be replicated in this one. Voldemort had cast the killing curse at Harry in the Forbidden Forest. Harry had survived because Voldemort had rebuilt his body using Harry's blood in the Priori Incantatem ritual. And that blood tether, Lily's ancient protection living inside Voldemort's own veins, had meant that Harry could not die while Voldemort lived. The soul fragment had been destroyed. Harry had returned from the liminal space between death and life. The scar had faded. 3 conditions had aligned simultaneously. The blood tether from the resurrection ritual, Harry's willing walk to his death invoking ancient sacrificial magic, and the Elder Wand's refusal to kill its true master. Remove any one of those conditions, and Harry died. Here was the problem that kept her awake in ways nothing else could. If she prevented Voldemort from ever returning to a body, if she dismantled his Horcrux infrastructure completely, destroyed every anchor he had created, then the resurrection ritual would never happen. The blood tether would never form. The scar Horcrux would remain inside Harry's head with no safe method of removal that she currently knew of. Every destruction method she could think of worked on objects. Harry was not an object. She had time, but she also had to be careful not to waste it. Arrival at Hogsmeade Station happened in darkness, exactly as she remembered it. The Hogwarts Express slowed through the final miles of Highland wilderness, with the particular grinding reluctance of something very large being asked to stop. And the corridor outside the compartment filled with the noise of first years scrambling to find cloaks and last-minute possessions that had somehow migrated to the wrong bags during the journey. Hermione packed her own things with the efficient calm of someone who had made camp in frozen fields and developed strong opinions about organized luggage. She had been expecting the disorientation of the height difference. She had not been entirely prepared for it. She had grown 3 inches between first year and fifth in the original timeline, and looking up at the mountains as the students filed onto the platform, looking up, when she was used to looking out, or even slightly down, produced a specific kind of wrongness that she filed carefully alongside all the other wrongness she was already carrying. Small body, enormous memories. The two things sat inside the same skin, like occupants of a house who had not yet decided whether they could tolerate each other. Fur's years. Fur's years over here. Hagrid's voice boomed across the platform with the force of a small natural disaster, and something cracked open in Hermione's chest before she had any chance to prepare for it. He was enormous and loud, and carrying his pink umbrella, and completely, entirely unaware that she knew him, that she had shared meals with him in his hut over 7 years, had defended his giant half-brother before a ministry tribunal that hadn't deserved her eloquence, had stood at his side at a funeral, and felt the specific helplessness of watching grief move through a body too large for ordinary comfort. He had cried at Harry's supposed death and carried him out of the Forbidden Forest as tenderly as something precious. He was looking at her like she was a stranger, because she was. Hermione followed the cluster of first years down the steep bank toward the lake and found herself assigned to a small boat with Harry, Ron, and a round-faced boy who was clutching a toad to his chest with the fierce concentration of someone who had already lost it twice that evening and was determined not to make it three. Neville Longbottom, he said, by way of introduction, his voice slightly breathless with the effort of simultaneously introducing himself and maintaining a grip on an amphibian that clearly had opinions about captivity. Hermione Granger. She looked at the toad, then at Neville's white-knuckled hands. "It's all right," she said quietly, as the boats began moving across the black water toward the castle lights. "Toads are genuinely difficult to keep track of. You're doing fine." He had no reason to trust her. She was a stranger who had just met him in the dark on a Scottish lakeshore. But she knew him, knew the man he would become, the extraordinary courage that lived inside what everyone around him would persistently mistake for timidity. She had watched Neville Longbottom stand in front of Voldemort with the sword of Gryffindor and refuse to break, and she had thought then, as she thought now, that she had never seen anything braver in her life. She would not overlook him this time. The castle rose out of the water, and the darkness slowly the way things revealed themselves in dreams. Turrets first, then towers. Then the full weight of 1,000 years of stone catching the moonlight and refusing to be anything less than magnificent. Hermione had crossed this lake 6 times in the original timeline. Forward once, returning home at the end of each year, and she had never once stopped finding it beautiful. She let herself feel it now, just for a moment. The beauty of something she had genuinely believed she would never see again. Then the boats grounded on the far shore, and she was moving. Professor McGonagall met them in the entrance hall. She was exactly as Hermione remembered her, stern-faced and precise in her emerald robes, with the particular economy of movement that came from having done the same thing reliably for decades. She explained the sorting ceremony in terms that sent half the first years into a spiral of anxiety, outlined the house system with the brisk efficiency of someone who considered nervousness an inefficient use of everyone's time, and then left them to wait in the antechamber with the specific expression of a woman who had done this enough times to know that no amount of additional reassurance would help. Hermione watched her carefully. Minerva McGonagall was, in her considered estimation, one of the genuinely great witches of the age, not in the showy, legendary sense of Dumbledore's greatness, but in the deep and reliable sense of someone who showed up, did the work, and refused to compromise on the things that mattered. She had duelled Umbridge with cold, contained fury, and made it look effortless. She had stood at the gates of Hogwarts during the battle and announced, with the calm satisfaction of a woman who had been waiting 60 years for the opportunity, that she had always wanted to use that particular spell. She had cried silently at Harry's supposed death, and then kept fighting. Hermione was going to use her. She disliked the word. It felt like something she shouldn't be comfortable with, but it was accurate, and she had made her peace with accuracy. She was going to direct this woman's considerable intelligence and institutional authority toward an outcome McGonagall herself would have chosen if she'd possessed the information that Hermione did. That didn't make it not manipulation. It made it necessary manipulation, a distinction Hermione had been forced to develop sometime around age 15, and which she still found uncomfortable but no longer found paralyzing. The antechamber was full of nervous first years. Draco Malfoy was already performing social hierarchy with the practiced ease of someone raised to believe that status was a language everyone else should be grateful to have explained to them. He had singled Harry out, recognizing the name, extending what he clearly believed was a significant honor, and was turning away Ron with a particular contempt reserved for families who had, in his father's estimation, made the wrong choices. Hermione watched this without intervening. Harry's rejection of Malfoy, the moment when he would look at the extended hand and then look at Ron and make a choice, was something she had no intention of taking from him. It was the first independent moral decision Harry Potter made in the wizarding world, the first moment when he chose the person in front of him over the advantageous connection. That mattered. Some things had to be allowed to happen exactly as they happened. The ghosts drifted through the wall and sent the antechamber into a brief, predictable chaos of screaming. Then McGonagall returned, and the great doors opened, and they walked into the great hall. The ceiling was showing a clear September night, stars scattered across a darkness so precise it took a moment to understand it wasn't real sky. The candles floated at exactly the height Hermione remembered. The 4 long house tables stretched away toward the high table where the staff sat in a row of different silences, some curious, some bored, some carefully neutral. Hermione spent 3 seconds talking herself down from a wave of grief so severe it nearly stopped her walking. She was here. She was really here. The last time she had stood in this room, she had been stepping over the bodies of people she loved. She breathed. She kept walking. The sorting hat sat on its stool at the front of the hall, old, patched, frayed along the brim, completely ordinary looking to anyone who didn't understand what it was. Hermione understood exactly what it was. She had spent 7 years in the wizarding world, developing a much more precise understanding of the sorting hat than was available in any standard first-year text. It read minds. Not in the blunt, violating way that unskilled legilimency worked. Not ransacking, not forcing, but with the careful, comprehensive attention of something that had been doing this for 1,000 years and had developed considerable nuance. It read conscious thought and subconscious inclination, memories, abilities, fears, desires, potential, every layer of personality laid open for its assessment. When the hat touched her head tonight, it would see everything. The Battle of Hogwarts, every Horcrux location, Snape's true allegiance, Dumbledore's plan to allow Harry to walk to his death, the deaths of 50 people, 7 years of a war that hadn't happened yet. The Sorting Hat was about to receive a complete download of the next 7 years of wizarding history from a war veteran wearing an 11-year-old's body. Hermione had spent a considerable amount of time on the train thinking about this. The risk was obvious. If the hat shared what it saw with Dumbledore or any other staff member, every plan she had made would collapse before it had properly begun. She would be brought before the ministry, studied, questioned, and likely have her memory modified before anyone bothered to ask whether she was actually dangerous or just extraordinarily well informed. But the opportunity was equally significant. In 1,000 years of continuous operation, the sorting hat had never been shown to share a student's private thoughts with anyone, not even the headmaster. It kept its own counsel absolutely. It was, in a strange and particular sense, the most reliably trustworthy confidant in the entire building. It could not be compelled to testify. It could not be legitimized. It sat on a shelf and waited, and it kept every secret it had ever been given, because it understood that the sorting process only worked if students knew their minds were safe. And beyond trust, there was utility. If the hat saw her complete strategic map, if it understood exactly what she carried and why, it might, within the limits of its operational capacity, become something approaching a silent ally. It couldn't act. It sorted students and offered occasional cryptic warnings in song, but it also could not be used against her. Her secrets would be safer inside a 1,000-year-old sentient artifact than in any human mind she could think of. The question of house selection was not a sentimental one. She had examined it from every angle. She could make a case for all four houses. She had the courage of Gryffindor. She had walked into a war repeatedly with full knowledge of what she was walking into. She had the intellect of Ravenclaw. Her mind was her primary weapon, and always had been. She had the cunning of Slytherin. She was, at this precise moment, executing a covert operation to rewrite the history of the wizarding world from a position of zero institutional power. She had the loyalty of Hufflepuff. She had come back through time for the people she loved, which was about as pure an expression of that value as she could imagine. But the strategic case for Gryffindor was overwhelming, and sentiment had nothing to do with it. She needed to be in Harry's common room, for proximity, for protection, for the ability to respond quickly when things went wrong, rather than running from a different tower. She needed physical proximity to Scabbers, who lived in the Gryffindor boys' dormitory 1 floor below. She needed the established trust of Minerva McGonagall, who would become her head of house and who was the specific adult she had already identified as the key to the Pettigrew operation. She needed the social credibility that came from being Harry Potter's housemate and close friend, rather than a girl from another table who happened to be friendly and inexplicably well-informed. Ravenclaw would have placed her near the room of requirement in the Diadem Horcrux on the 7th floor, but she could access the 7th-floor corridor from any house. Slytherin would have given her intelligence on Death Eater children, but would have destroyed her ability to befriend Harry openly and would have positioned her in direct opposition to everything she was trying to protect. Hufflepuff was simply not strategically useful in the ways she needed. Gryffindor was not sentiment, it was strategy. The sorting proceeded alphabetically. Abbott, Hannah, Hufflepuff, after 30 seconds of deliberation. The sequence continued down the list, each name called with a particular weight of ceremony, each student walking forward with the specific bravery of someone who had no idea what they were walking into. Lavender Brown, Gryffindor, immediately and loudly. Millicent Bulstrode, Slytherin, with the hat barely touching her head. Hermione watched each sorting with the particular attention of someone who knew what these children would become. She watched Vincent Crabbe and Gregory Goyle go to Slytherin without ceremony, remembering that Goyle would die in his own fiend fire in the room of requirement. She watched Justin Finch Fletchley go to Hufflepuff, remembering him petrified in the hospital wing in second year. Remembering that he'd survived, she watched Neville Longbottom approach the stool with visible terror and be sorted into Gryffindor, and felt something settle in her chest that was adjacent to relief. Granger, Hermione. She walked forward. The great hall had the specific quality of silence that came from several hundred people paying close attention to something. She sat on the stool. Professor McGonagall placed the hat on her head with the careful precision of someone who had performed this action thousands of times. The darkness was immediate and complete. Then a voice, dry, ancient, and carrying the particular quality of something that had been genuinely surprised perhaps twice in the last century, and was currently experiencing one of those moments. Well, a pause that felt like the mental equivalent of a long breath. I have sorted 4,216 students in this school. I have never encountered anything remotely like you. I imagine not. You're not 11 years old. My body is. No, the hat agreed, with something approaching dryness. Definitely not. She felt it moving through her memories, carefully, not intrusively, with the deliberate attention of something reading a very dense text and choosing to honor the weight of what it was being shown. She let it look. She had decided to let it look. There was no point in attempting to hide from something specifically designed to see through people, and she had calculated that the benefits of the hat understanding her situation outweighed any risk it posed. She felt it find the Battle of Hogwarts and linger. She felt it find the Horcruxes and the careful map she had built of their locations and the plan she had constructed around that map. She felt it find Snape's true allegiance, the whole devastatingly complicated truth of it, and the Elder Wand, and Dumbledore's knowledge of what Harry would have to do. You know everything. Not everything. Enough. Another pause. Considerably longer. In the great hall, the students would be shifting, whispering to each other, wondering what was taking so long. 5 seconds of silence with the hat was unusual. 10 was remarkable. She was approaching what would be officially classified as a near hat stall. The fragment of Voldemort's soul in the boy's scar. She waited. The hat was very still around her thoughts. You came back for them. For all of them. Yes. And the boy doesn't know. Not yet. When there's a solution, I'll tell him. I won't ask him to carry it without being able to do anything about it. Another silence, different in texture from the ones before it, something more deliberate in it, like a decision being made. Gryffindor, the hat said finally. Its tone was not the bored certainty it used for easy sortings, or the reluctant conclusion of a hat style, or the enthusiastic confidence of a placement it was particularly pleased with. It was something else, something Hermione had not heard from it before, and which she suspected very few people had ever heard from it in 1,000 years of use. It sounded like respect. Not because you're brave, it said quietly, in the moment before the word was spoken aloud, though you are, considerably. Because you're right. Gryffindor gives you what you need. I hope you know what you're doing, child. So do I, Hermione said honestly. Gryffindor. The table in red and gold erupted in applause with the particular enthusiasm of people welcoming someone after an unusually tense waiting period. Hermione walked toward it and sat down at the end of the bench, and turned back to watch the stool in time to see Professor McGonagall place the hat on a small boy with untidy black hair and glasses. Harry Potter's sorting took 4 minutes and 12 seconds. She counted every one of them. She couldn't hear the conversation happening under the brim, but she knew what was being said. She knew that Harry's mind was broadcasting not Slytherin. Not Slytherin with the desperation of a child who had already decided that name represented everything wrong in a world that had been wrong to him for as long as he could remember. She knew the hat was arguing, making its case for the cunning and resourcefulness it could see in him. She knew Harry was holding firm. Gryffindor! Harry practically ran to the table. He sat down with the expression of someone who had been holding their breath for an uncomfortably long time, and had finally been permitted to exhale. Hermione shifted down the bench, leaving the seat beside her empty. Harry looked at it, then at her, with the startled gratitude of someone who hadn't expected anyone to save him a place. Well done, she said quietly. Thanks, he said. You too. A pause. The hat took ages with you. Difficult case, she said. I don't think it quite knew what to do with me. Ron dropped into the seat on Harry's other side a few moments later, and the feast materialized on the tables in the particular abundance of something designed to make 11-year-olds believe they had arrived somewhere that would always take care of them. And the three of them were already a unit, not assembled by accident and emergency in a second-floor bathroom on Halloween, not forged from loneliness and shared danger, assembled here, now, in the first hour of the first night, because Hermione had decided that every choice this time would be intentional. The feast rolled around them in waves of noise and warmth, and the smell of good food. Dumbledore stood and gave his opening remarks with the particular combination of gravity and gentle absurdity that she had always found simultaneously exasperating and deeply reassuring. He welcomed them. He noted that the third-floor corridor was out of bounds to all who did not wish to die most painfully, which caused a ripple of nervous laughter that suggested most of the first years were uncertain whether it was a joke. It was not a joke. Hermione filed that away under already in motion and turned her attention down the staff table. Professor Quirrell was seated several places from the center, his turban prominent and his manner carrying the particular quality of someone performing a version of themselves rather than actually being it. She had catalogued the signs before on the train, and she catalogued them again now. The stiffness of his neck as he turned. Not the stiffness of injury, but the deliberate, careful orientation of someone maintaining a fixed relationship to a specific area of his own body. The garlic smell that reached her even from this distance, stronger than any reasonable personal preference could account for, with the specific chemical edge of something being used rather than enjoyed. His eyes moved with the restless quality of something that was not entirely directing them. Voldemort was in this room, barely coherent, weaker than he had been in 50 years, a parasite clinging to a host he was slowly destroying. Without a single active servant in the British wizarding world, because the only one who had been looking for him was currently asleep in a boy's pocket, 3 tables over. He was here, and Hermione was here, and she was the only person in the building who knew where to look. She ate her chicken. She laughed at something Ron said about Percy's prefect badge, with the slightly superior air of someone who was in his first year and therefore felt entitled to have opinions about his older brother's institutional enthusiasm. She noticed that Harry had slowed down in his eating and was looking at the table with the slightly dazed expression of someone encountering abundance after long deprivation. She knew the Dursleys' patterns well enough to understand the instinct toward scarcity that lived in him, the calibration for not having enough that made having too much feel somehow suspect. Have more, she said, pushing the serving dish toward him. You should eat. Okay, he said, and took more with the simple, uncomplicated trust of someone who had not yet learned to question kindness from unexpected directions. Hermione looked up at the staff table and found Dumbledore watching her. Not with suspicion, with interest. Sharp, precise, the kind of intellectual attention he gave to things that didn't fit the models he had spent decades refining. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, then looked away. She already knew about Dumbledore's surface legilimency, the habit of a man who had spent 60 years gathering information from faces, the casual, shallow reading he performed almost unconsciously during eye contact. She had decided to let him see exactly what she wanted him to see. A muggle-born first year who was unusually composed, unusually perceptive, unusually unafraid for a child at her first sorting feast. Nothing alarming, just enough to make him pay attention. She would need his attention very soon. The Gryffindor common room was warm and exactly as she remembered it, and standing in the entrance and feeling the specific texture of that familiarity was one of the stranger experiences of a day that had contained a significant number of strange experiences. She had done homework in every corner of this room. She had planned a war from the fireplace end and argued through the small hours in the window alcoves and sat on the floor doing nothing in particular on quiet Sunday afternoons before everything had gone catastrophically wrong. She stood in the entrance and felt, briefly, completely undone by the weight of recognizing something she had believed she would never see again. Then Lavender Brown walked into the back of her and apologized, and Hermione pulled herself together and went upstairs. The girls' dormitory had 5 beds, 5 trunks, and 4 other first-year girls who were primarily concerned with the relative softness of the mattresses and whether Hogwarts consistently provided food of this quality, or whether the first night was strategically exceptional. Parvati Patil wanted to discuss divination at considerable length. Lavender Brown wanted to know whether anyone had noticed the Ravenclaw boy with the nice eyes at the feast. Hermione responded in monosyllables and unpacked her trunk with the efficiency of someone who knew how to organize limited space under conditions considerably more demanding than a comfortable dormitory. When the others were asleep, she lay in the darkness with her eyes open. The plan, from the top. The Pettigrew operation was the most urgent, immediate priority, because it was load-bearing. Exposing Peter Pettigrew freed Sirius Black. Freeing Sirius gave Harry a guardian. A real one, someone who loved him and had the legal authority to act on that love, and gave Hermione an adult ally with every personal reason to help her. The credibility she would build by identifying Pettigrew, an 11-year-old who had noticed what the entire ministry had missed for a decade, would make everything that came after possible. It would establish the pattern. She brought evidence, adults acted on it, outcomes improved. But it had to be done correctly. She was 11 years old. She had no credibility, no proof, no ability to cast the reversal spell herself. She needed an adult who could cast it, had the authority to act on what they found, and would be receptive to the approach she was planning. The target was McGonagall. McGonagall was a registered animagus herself. She would understand the significance of an unregistered one in a way that no one else on the staff quite would. She had known the marauders. She had been present during Sirius's arrest. She had presumably spent a decade with a private, suppressed doubt about whether the official account was complete, suppressing it under the weight of institutional conclusion, because she hadn't had a reason to pull that thread. Hermione was going to hand her the reason. The approach needed to be meticulous. An 11-year-old with a theory about a disguised murderer living in a student's pocket was either a prodigy or delusional, and the difference between those two categories came down entirely to how the evidence was presented. She needed to construct the case entirely from publicly available information. She needed it to look like detective work, not foreknowledge. 2 months to build the circumstantial foundation. Then one precisely constructed conversation with McGonagall. Then Dumbledore. Then Veritaserum, and a confession and Sirius Black walking out of Azkaban before Christmas. It was a good plan. It was a solid plan. It had 17 separate ways it could go wrong, and she had contingencies for 11 of them. She turned onto her side, pressed her shaking hands together, and breathed slowly. 4 counts in, hold, 4 counts out, the way she had learned from Luna Lovegood of all people during the weeks they had spent in the Lovegood house after the battle. Both of them too hollowed out for anything except the most basic maintenance of continuing to exist. She was here. She was alive. Nobody was dead yet. She had a chance. That was more than she'd had this morning. October brought the specific rhythm of academic routine. Classes and homework and meals, and the particular social landscape of first years sorting themselves into functional groups and operational alliances. Hermione navigated it with the careful attention of someone who remembered how it had gone the first time and had strong feelings about improving the outcome. She did not raise her hand in every class. This required considerably more self-restraint than she was comfortable admitting, sitting in charms while Professor Flitwick explained something she had understood for years, watching other students struggle with concepts she could have clarified in 30 seconds, keeping her hand down and her expression pleasantly attentive. It felt profoundly unnatural. But she had enough distance from the original timeline to understand what the constant hand-raising had actually been. A child performing competence as a defense against the fear of not belonging, filling silence with knowledge, because knowledge was the only currency she had that anyone had ever valued. She let other students answer first. She assessed their level and spoke when she had something specific to contribute. She sat beside Harry in their shared classes and asked him genuine questions about what he thought, rather than telling him what to think. She laughed at Rom's jokes when they were actually funny, which was, she discovered with some surprise, considerably more often than she had given him credit for in the original timeline. The social architecture of their friendship assembled itself faster and more solidly than it had before. By the second week of October, Harry and Ron were saving her a seat at meals without discussing it. By the third week, the three of them were doing homework together in the common room as a matter of course. There was no troll incident in the second-floor bathroom, because Quirrell had no reason to release a troll yet, no scheme to create a diversion, no plan that required the Great Hall to empty quickly. They were already a unit without it, assembled from genuine compatibility rather than shared emergency. This was the foundation. Everything else required this foundation. The real work happened in the Hogwarts library on Thursday afternoons. Hermione had identified her sources with the precision of someone who had spent 7 years developing research skills under conditions ranging from moderately difficult to actively catastrophic. The Hogwarts Library's daily archive of the Prophet extended back decades. She had verified this in her second visit, asking Madame Pince a carefully casual question about historical newspaper availability, framing it as general interest in wizarding history. She found the articles about Peter Pettigrew's death in the third week of October. They were exactly where she had known they would be. 3 separate pieces: the initial incident report, the ministry's official conclusion, and a follow-up covering Sirius Black's subsequent capture. She read them with the detached professionalism of a researcher, making careful notes on separate parchment, refusing to let the grief that lived behind her eyes make its way into her handwriting. The facts, presented without the context she carried. Peter Pettigrew had been killed by Sirius Black on November the 1st, 1981, in a London street confrontation. The only remains recovered were a single finger. 12 Muggle bystanders had also died, killed by an explosion attributed to Sirius. Black had been apprehended at the scene, laughing, and taken directly to Azkaban without trial. What, Hermione also noted from a smaller article in the same archive, was the Ministry's complete absence of any record of Pettigrew as an animagus. He had never registered, because he had never intended to register, and because no one had ever thought to ask whether a man who had apparently been blown to fragments might have made other arrangements. 1 finger recovered. 3-year maximum lifespan for common rats. 12 years of impossible survival in a family that had never questioned it. The case built itself from public record. She just needed to present it to the right person. Professor McGonagall held office hours on Wednesday evenings, 6 to 7:30. In the original timeline, Hermione had never used them in first year. She hadn't needed to, and the relationship between them had remained cordially formal until much later, when circumstance had forced a different kind of understanding. She knocked on McGonagall's office door on the last Wednesday of October at exactly 6:15. "Come in, Miss Granger." The office was precisely organized in the way of someone who considered disorder a personal failing. Essays stacked by year group, quills in a ceramic holder, a tartan tin of shortbread on the corner of the desk that she never offered to students but occasionally ate from between appointments. A framed photograph of the 1967 Gryffindor Quidditch team hung on the wall behind her, the players moving in their small looping patterns. "I had a research question," Hermione said, sitting down in the chair across the desk, without waiting to be asked, not rudely, just with the efficiency of someone who didn't waste movement. She caught McGonagall's slight eyebrow raise at the confidence of it and modulated accordingly, straightening slightly. "If that's all right." Professor, what is your question? I've been reading ahead in transfiguration theory, Hermione said carefully, specifically the section on animagus transformation. I understood the principles of the transformation itself, but I couldn't find a clear explanation in any of the standard texts of how one would detect an unregistered animagus. The books discuss registered animagi and how to verify registration, but the detection question specifically seems to be absent. McGonagall's expression remained entirely professional. That is indeed a gap in standard educational materials. Detection of unregistered animagi is considered advanced magic. It isn't typically covered until newt level, if at all. I understand. I was just curious about the principle. A pause, precisely timed. Is there a reversal spell that would force an animagus back to human form? Something that would work even without the subject's cooperation? There is, McGonagall said. The animagus reversal charm is a specialized untransfiguration. Quite advanced work, but a straightforward enough principle. It triggers the involuntary reversal of the transformation regardless of the subject's intention. A standard animal would be entirely unaffected by it. The spell would simply find nothing to reverse. So it would be harmless to a normal animal, Hermione said slowly, as if working through the implications in real time, but would reveal a transformed wizard. In theory, one could cast it on any animal with suspicious characteristics and know definitively whether it was an animagus or simply an animal. McGonagall studied her with the expression of someone who was beginning to connect observations that didn't yet form a complete picture. What prompted this particular line of inquiry, Miss Granger? This is unusually specialized research for a first year. Here was the pivot. Hermione had planned every word of what came next. I was reading the library's daily archive, she said. Historical research. I found the 1981 articles about Peter Pettigrew and the Sirius Black arrest. A microsecond of stillness in McGonagall's expression, almost invisible. Hermione caught it. I see, McGonagall said carefully. I noticed something that seemed like a discrepancy. Hermione kept her voice entirely level, the voice of someone presenting a logical puzzle, not an accusation. The article said Pettigrew was killed and only a single finger was recovered. I'd also been reading about the lifespan of magical animals for a creatures essay, and I happened to know that Ron Weasley has a rat, called Scabbers, that his older brother had for approximately 12 years before passing it down, which is well beyond the natural lifespan of even a magical rat. She paused. Scabbers is also missing a toe on his front right paw. The silence in McGonagall's office lasted 4 full seconds. One finger, McGonagall said, very quietly. One finger, Hermione confirmed. I might be completely wrong. It might just be a coincidence, an old rat with a missing toe and an unusually long life. But I thought that given your expertise in animagi and your knowledge of that era, you would be far better placed than I am to evaluate whether this was worth investigating. She met McGonagall's eyes directly. It's your area of magic. You would know immediately whether the pattern means anything. She had framed it perfectly. She wasn't accusing anyone. She wasn't claiming foreknowledge. She was an unusually perceptive 11-year-old, presenting a pattern she had noticed through legitimate archival research and bringing it to the relevant expert with full and genuine deference to that expert's judgment. She was not asking McGonagall to believe her. She was giving McGonagall permission to investigate something that McGonagall already had the power, and Hermione suspected the long-suppressed inclination to resolve. McGonagall's hands were flat on her desk. How long have you had this theory, Miss Granger? I started finding the pieces last week. I kept waiting to find an obvious flaw in the reasoning. I couldn't find one. A pause. That's why I came to you. You did the right thing, McGonagall said. Her voice had shifted from its professional register into something quieter and more deliberate, something that carried weight in a way her usual tone didn't. Leave this with me, Miss Granger, and please, Say nothing to anyone. Not Harry, not Ron, not until I've had time to look into it." "Of course, Professor." Hermione stood, nodded once, and left. In the corridor outside, she pressed her back against the stone wall and closed her eyes. Her heart was hammering. She had known it would work. She had planned it to work with the careful precision of someone who had been thinking about nothing else for 8 weeks. But the knowing and the doing were different things entirely, and her body had not been informed about the certainty of the plan. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them together. 4 counts in, hold. 4 counts out. The mechanism was in motion. McGonagall went to Dumbledore that same evening. Hermione knew this not from observation, but from inference, because McGonagall was not a woman who sat on actionable information overnight, and because the question of Sirius Black's guilt was not a small one. Whatever private doubts Dumbledore himself had harbored about the official verdict, and she was certain he'd had them, Dumbledore was too perceptive not to have had them. McGonagall had presumably kept hers carefully suppressed under the weight of institutional conclusion. Hermione had given both of them something more powerful than evidence. She had given them permission to trust the doubt they had never voiced. She spent the next 3 days behaving with complete normality: classes, homework, meals, a game of exploding snap with Ron that she lost deliberately, because winning every single game was its own kind of problem. She helped Harry with his transfiguration essay and did not write it for him, though the temptation to simply take the quill and do it properly was considerable. On the 3rd day, McGonagall requested her presence during morning break. "I spoke with the headmaster," McGonagall said when Hermione sat down. "He has arranged for a formal examination of the Weasley family's rat. It will be conducted tomorrow morning while the boys are in class, to avoid disruption." A pause. "Professor Dumbledore would like to speak with you this afternoon." She looked at Hermione for a long moment, the look of someone reassessing the person in front of them against a previous model that was no longer adequate. "I should tell you, Miss Granger, that what you've brought to us, if you're correct, is not a small matter." "I understand," Hermione said. "Do you think I'm right, Professor?" McGonagall was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. "I think," she said carefully, "that you have asked exactly the questions I should have asked 10 years ago." Dumbledore's office was exactly as she remembered it: the whirring silver instruments, the portraits of previous headmasters sleeping or performing sleep along the walls, Fawkes the Phoenix on his perch, the sorting hat on its shelf, the pensieve on its cabinet. She had been in this room perhaps a dozen times, across 7 years, and it had always produced a slight feeling of being pleasantly off balance, which, she had eventually come to understand, was at least partially deliberate. Dumbledore arranged his environment to give himself observational advantage, everything slightly overwhelming, curiosities drawing the eye while he watched the face. She looked at the instruments and portraits with genuine interest, keeping her expression open and appropriately wondering. Partly performance, partly real. There was something about the quality of the afternoon light through the tower windows that genuinely was beautiful, and she had learned enough about loss to be attentive to beauty when it presented itself. "Please sit down, Hermione." He was watching her with those sharp blue eyes, and she felt the feather-light brush of surface legilimency, the gentle habit-formed reading of a man who had spent 60 years gathering information from faces. She let it find exactly what she wanted it to find: a clever girl who had done library research, who was nervous but composed, who was genuinely uncertain about whether her theory was correct. A child who had noticed something and brought it forward because it seemed important. Nothing more. "Thank you for bringing this to Professor McGonagall's attention," he said. "I understand you found the connection through the archive. The age of the rat was so far outside normal parameters that I couldn't explain it any other way," Hermione said. "I kept looking for a simpler explanation and couldn't find one." A pause. "Was I wrong to come forward?" "If you were wrong, you were not wrong to come forward," Dumbledore said. "On the contrary." He looked at her steadily. You noticed something that I confess I should have noticed myself. He said it without apparent embarrassment, but she saw the quality of stillness in him that indicated genuine discomfort being carefully managed. The examination will take place tomorrow morning, he continued. I wanted to speak with you today, too. He paused slightly. Understand how a first-year student came to be researching the deaths of wizards from a decade before she was born. I'm interested in history, Hermione said. I read the library archive systematically. I noticed the discrepancy because I happened to have been reading about Animagus transformation on the same day I read the 1981 articles. She met his eyes directly. It was luck and pattern recognition. He was reading her surface thoughts during this eye contact. She let him find composure, genuine intelligence, and the specific anxiety of an 11-year-old who was not entirely certain whether she had done something impressive or something troubling. Nothing more. Nothing he could follow. Pattern recognition, Dumbledore repeated, with the expression of someone filing information away at considerable speed. A valuable skill, one I suspect will continue to serve you well. A pause, deliberate, waited. I want you to know, Hermione, that whatever we find tomorrow, the matter will be handled appropriately. You have done the right thing in bringing this forward, and I won't forget it. She understood the message underneath the words. He was telling her she had made an ally, that the information she had provided would be honored. Thank you, Professor, she said. Hermione was in charms when the examination happened. She sat through Flitwick's lesson on the levitation charm, with her wand moving precisely, her feather rising on the second attempt, without any of the dramatic struggle most of her classmates were experiencing, and kept the rest of her attention fixed somewhere she couldn't see. She knew what was happening one floor below. She had seen it happen in the Shrieking Shack 2 years later in the original timeline. The blue-white flash of the reversal spell, the grotesque moment of transformation, Pettigrew's rat-like face blinking in torchlight. Small and balding and cornered, the man who had destroyed more lives than she could count in the space of one betrayal. Ron's reaction was what she couldn't see and had to imagine. She would need to be careful with him. He had had Scabbers for 3 years, had inherited the rat from Percy, had carried him in his pocket on this very train. He had no reason to associate his pet with any of this. No framework for understanding that the animal he had considered a mild inconvenience was actually a person who had made catastrophic choices. The loss of the rat was nothing. The knowledge that he had been sleeping in the same dormitory as the man who had betrayed Harry's parents was something else entirely. She went to find Ron at lunch. He was sitting at the Gryffindor table with Harry, and both of them had the blank, slightly flattened expression of people who had been told something enormous, and were still in the process of working out which way it had changed everything. Hermione sat down beside Harry. You knew, Harry said. It wasn't a question. I was told this morning that Professor Dumbledore was going to examine Scabbers, Hermione said carefully. I'd noticed some things about him that seemed strange. I brought them to Professor McGonagall. She paused. I didn't know for certain what they would find. Ron was staring at his empty plate. He was my rat, he said finally in a voice that was trying very hard to be even. I slept in the same dormitory as... He stopped. As him. I know, Hermione said. I'm sorry, Ron. Is it true, he confessed? Under veritaserum? They'll administer it this afternoon, Hermione said. He'll confirm everything. She caught herself. Too certain, too definitive. I think he will. The evidence is very strong. Harry was quiet for a long moment, looking at the table. Sirius Black didn't do it, he said finally. No, Hermione said. He's been in Azkaban for 10 years for something he didn't do. Harry looked at his plate, then at her. How long have you known about this? I started putting the pieces together a few weeks ago. I couldn't do anything by myself. I needed an adult who could cast the reversal spell and had the authority to act on what they found. She met his eyes directly. I went to McGonagall as soon as the pattern was clear. Harry looked at her for a long moment, with an expression she recognized. The expression of someone recalibrating their understanding of another person, revising a model that had been working perfectly well but had just proved insufficient. "You figured this out on your own," he said, "in the first month of school." "I read a lot," she said. Ron made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "She reads a lot," he repeated, to no one in particular. "Brilliant." Peter Pettigrew's formal examination took place in Dumbledore's office that afternoon, with Dumbledore, McGonagall, and two auras present. Pettigrew, restrained, cornered, without the option of transformation that had been his survival strategy for 12 years, confessed comprehensively under Veritaserum. He had been the Potter's secret keeper, not Sirius. He had betrayed James and Lily willingly, not under duress. He had murdered the 12 Muggles himself, blasting the street with his own wand, cut off his own finger, and transformed, leaving Sirius alone at the scene. He had spent 12 years as a rat in the Weasley family, waiting for any indication that Voldemort might return to a position where he could be useful to him. The dark mark on his arm was visible and physically present, additional corroboration that no truth serum could have manufactured. Cornelius Fudge, barely a year into his tenure as Minister for Magic, arrived at Hogwarts within 2 hours of being contacted. He arrived, Hermione understood from later accounts filtered through Ron and Harry, with the particular energy of a politician who had just recognized both a disaster and an opportunity simultaneously. The disaster was a decade of wrongful imprisonment. The opportunity was that correcting it while Voldemort remained powerless was considerably cheaper than having it surface at a worse moment. Dumbledore's guidance was, as it tended to be, decisive. Sirius Black's formal exoneration papers were filed within 48 hours. The legal process for establishing him as Harry's rightful guardian, a process that had been denied at every turn in the original timeline because no one had believed him innocent, moved with the brisk efficiency of a ministry that wanted this resolved quietly, completely, and in a way that reflected well on the current administration. Sirius Black was released from Azkaban on the 15th of November, 1991. Hermione learned this from the front page of the Daily Prophet, which ran a photograph of a man who looked a decade older than his age, gaunt and pale and blinking in unfamiliar sunlight, with the careful slowness of someone relearning how it felt to be warm. The article noted the decade of wrongful imprisonment, offered the ministry's deepest apologies, and described the evidence that had led to the discovery in terms that made it sound like the natural result of excellent investigative work by unnamed sources. She read it 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her trunk, under her winter robes. Harry received a letter from Dumbledore the same morning. He read it at breakfast. By the time he finished, his hands were shaking. He looked up at Hermione with eyes that were doing something complicated, several emotions moving through them too quickly to track individually, each one large enough to qualify as significant on its own. "He wants to meet me," Harry said. "Sirius, my godfather." He stopped. "Dumbledore says he has legal guardianship, that I don't have to go back to the Dursleys for Christmas. That I could. You could spend Christmas with your godfather," Hermione said. Harry put the letter down with the particular care of someone handling something that might dissolve if held too firmly. "This happened because of you," he said. "It happened because of a 12-year-old rat with a missing toe," Hermione said. "I just noticed." "Hermione." His voice was very quiet. "Thank you." She looked at this boy who had spent the first 11 years of his life being told he wasn't wanted, who had learned to make himself small to avoid his uncle's anger, who had never in his memory had a Christmas with people who loved him, and thought about the parallel version of this child, walking into a forest at 17 to let himself be murdered because no one had been able to find another way. With Pettigrew exposed, and Sirius's exoneration moving through the ministry with the speed of an institution that wanted the matter closed before anyone looked too closely at why it had taken a decade, Hermione turned her attention to the next phase of the operation. She had established credibility. She had demonstrated in the most concrete terms available to an 11-year-old with no institutional authority that her observations were worth taking seriously. She had an adult ally in McGonagall, who now looked at her with the particular expression of someone who had revised their model of a person upward significantly and was still in the process of adjusting. She had Dumbledore's attention, the genuine, focused attention of a man who did not give it lightly. Now she needed to use both. She requested a meeting with Dumbledore through McGonagall, framing it as a follow-up concern arising from her Pettigrew research. She had noticed other things, she said, things she wanted to bring to his attention. She was admitted to his office on a Tuesday evening in late November, with Fawkes on his perch and a fire burning and the quiet accumulated weight of a room that had seen too much history to be impressed by any individual contribution to it. "I wanted to tell you something about Professor Quirrell," she said, sitting down. Dumbledore's expression did not change. "Yes," he said carefully. "I've been watching him since term started. As have I." She laid it out precisely, in the language of observation and inference, rather than the language of certainty. The garlic smell, disproportionate to any reasonable personal preference, stronger on warm days when the chemical properties of whatever it was masking became more volatile. The specific stiffness of his neck, not the stiffness of injury or habit, but the deliberate maintenance of a fixed orientation, someone keeping a particular area consistently turned away from direct contact. The pattern of his absences from the staff table, which she had been tracking since the start of term, and which clustered around specific calendar phases, in a way that wasn't random. His habit of gravitating toward the third-floor corridor, with the particular focus of something drawn to what was hidden there. "These are careful observations," Dumbledore said. "I also looked into his record," Hermione continued. "He spent the year before this one in Albania. There are accounts in the library archive of unusual animal deaths in Albanian forests over the last several years. Patterns consistent with a parasitic presence feeding on local wildlife. Something moving through the region, something that needed living hosts to sustain itself." She paused. "I don't know what's behind his turban, but I believe whatever happened to him in Albania is still with him, and I think it's interested in what's on the third floor." The silence lasted 7 seconds, long enough that Fawkes shifted on his perch and regarded them both with one bright eye. "What is behind his turban?" Dumbledore asked, very quietly. "I don't know," Hermione said, and this was, in the most technically precise sense, true. She was 11 years old and had arrived at this conclusion through library research and pattern recognition. She could not claim to know the specific form of what Quirrell carried. "But I think it's something dark, something that came back from Albania with him and hasn't left." Dumbledore looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze steadily and let him see what she wanted him to see. A brilliant, methodical first year with a demonstrated track record of accurate observation, presenting a carefully evidenced concern to the appropriate authority, a child who noticed patterns and understood their implications. "You are not what I expected, Hermione Granger," he said finally. "I read a lot," she said. The ghost of something that was almost a smile moved across his face. "I will look into Professor Quirrell's situation personally. I ask that you say nothing of this to anyone, and that you keep yourself away from the third-floor corridor." "Of course, Professor." She stood, walked to the door, then, with the careful timing of someone who had rehearsed this specific moment, "There's one more thing I'd like to discuss with you. When you've dealt with Professor Quirrell, something more complex than Peter Pettigrew, significantly more complex," she said, "but not urgent in the same way. It can wait until after Christmas." She left him with that. The strategic placement of those final sentences was entirely deliberate. She was giving Dumbledore time. Time to handle Quirrell, to process what he found, to arrive at their next conversation with his mind already oriented toward dark magic of a nature beyond ordinary classification. She was priming the conversation she needed to have, and she was establishing the foundational pattern of their relationship. She brought him complete, evidenced intelligence, and he acted on it. He was already learning to trust the pattern. Dumbledore moved on Quirrell before the Christmas break. The specific mechanism was not publicly announced, and Hermione did not ask. The outcome was visible enough. Quirrell was absent from the final week of term for health reasons, and he did not return after Christmas. The defense position was filled in January by a qualified substitute with a clean record and no Albanian travel history. She learned the details in fragments through the careful archaeology of overheard conversations and one direct sentence from Dumbledore when she returned for the spring term. "The matter with Professor Quirrell has been resolved," he said. "The entity that was using him has been dispersed. Voldemort's spirit, barely coherent, clinging to existence by the residual force of will rather than any stable anchor, had fled Quirrell's dying body and screamed back toward the Albanian forests, weaker than ever. Without a body, without a servant, without the specific foothold the Philosopher's Stone would have provided, because Dumbledore had removed the stone from Hogwarts entirely once he understood what was happening. Nicholas Flamel had been informed. The third-floor corridor was unsealed. Lord Voldemort's wraith was in Albania, alone, confused, without a single active servant in the British wizarding world, because Pettigrew had been the only one looking for him, and Pettigrew was in ministry custody. It was November. Hermione was 11 years old, and already the timeline she had lived through was fracturing so thoroughly that the war she remembered might never come to pass at all. She allowed herself exactly one evening of relief. She sat in the Gryffindor common room by the fire, with Harry on one side and Ron on the other, doing absolutely nothing productive, and let herself feel the specific lightness of a problem solved. She thought about everyone who was still alive. She thought about Remus Lupin, no longer quite so isolated. Sirius's freedom had already begun drawing him back into contact with people who cared about him. She thought about Dobby, who she hadn't found a solution for yet, but who had more time now. She thought about Cedric Diggory, alive and 14 years old, who would stay that way if everything continued to go correctly. One evening. Then she thought about the scar on Harry's forehead, the one anchor she hadn't dismantled, the one thing that connected Voldemort to continued existence, even as a barely coherent wraith. The one problem that didn't have an answer yet. One evening of relief. Then back to work. She requested a meeting with Dumbledore in the second week of January, framing it as the follow-up she had promised before Christmas. She had information, she said, about the nature of Voldemort's immortality that she believed he needed to have. He received her on a Thursday evening. The fire was burning. Fawkes was on his perch. Outside the tower windows, the January grounds were white and still. Hermione sat across from him, folded her hands on her knees, and said, "I believe Voldemort created multiple soul anchors to prevent his own death. I believe these are the reason he survived the killing curse's rebound in 1981. And I believe I know where most of them are." The silence that followed was the longest she had ever sat through in this office. "Soul anchors," Dumbledore said finally, carefully. "The technical term, I believe, is Horcrux," Hermione said, "a dark object into which a fragment of the soul is placed, requiring first the commission of murder to split the soul through the act of ultimate evil. As long as the Horcrux survives, its maker cannot permanently die." Dumbledore's face underwent a series of changes she found difficult to catalogue precisely. Shock, recognition, the confirmation of a theory held for years without sufficient proof, and something that might have been relief. The specific relief of no longer being alone with a suspicion too large and too dark to examine without someone to examine it with. "Where did you find this information?" he asked. "I've been reading very broadly," she said, which was entirely accurate. She had read everything that existed on Horcruxes in the original timeline. had helped Harry build his understanding from first principles during months of camping in frozen wilderness with inadequate food and too much fear. There are references in the restricted section that I accessed through Professor McGonagall's permission slip. She had been given a general restricted section pass in November, after the Pettigrew credibility establishment, and had used it strategically to construct a cover story that was internally coherent. The locations, Dumbledore said. You said you know where most of them are, based on Voldemort's known history and the objects you would have had access to. This framing was critical. She was presenting future knowledge as historical analysis, pattern recognition applied to biographical research. I believe he would have chosen objects of personal significance, trophies, heirlooms, artifacts connected to his heritage and his ambitions. She laid it out with the careful hedged language of someone who had constructed a theory from evidence rather than claiming the certainty of direct knowledge. Tom Riddle's diary. Dark objects capable of memory preservation and personality imprinting had theoretical precedence in restricted texts. A diary was a logical choice for someone who had grown up in isolation and valued the permanence of the written word. She believed Lucius Malfoy might currently have it, based on his proximity to Voldemort during the First War and the timing of certain events she had researched. Marvolo Gaunt's ring. The Gaunt family shack in Little Hangleton was Voldemort's maternal heritage, a location of deep personal significance he would certainly have visited. The ring was described in historical accounts of the Gaunt family as a generations-old heirloom. Slytherin's locket, Regulus Black's disappearance in 1979, and the fragmented account that could be pieced together from family records pointed toward an attempted Horcrux theft. The locket was almost certainly at 12 Grimmauld Place, in the possession of the house elf creature, who would have carried out his master's final instruction with the literal devotion that was the particular tragedy of house elf servitude. Ravenclaw's diadem, lost for centuries but located. She had spoken with Helena Ravenclaw's ghost during November and been told the story, establishing the detail in a way that had a verifiable source in the room of requirement on the 7th floor. Hufflepuff's cup in the Lestrange vault at Gringotts, based on the known inventory of Bellatrix Lestrange's possessions as documented in records she had accessed through the library's legal archive. Then she paused. Dumbledore was watching her with an intensity unlike anything she had seen from him in their previous meetings. He was not using legerdemaincy. He was simply listening, with his complete, undivided, formidable attention, in the way of someone who had just had the most significant intelligence of the century laid on his desk by a first-year student. Harry Scar, he said, very quietly. The words of a man who had suspected something for a very long time and had never allowed himself to follow the suspicion to its conclusion. I believe the killing curse's rebound in 1981 accidentally created a seventh Horcrux, Hermione said. The soul fragment attached itself to the nearest living thing when the curse rebounded. Harry survived because a piece of Voldemort's soul attached to him, and that connection is why the link between them exists. The dreams, the parcel tongue, all of it. You understand what that would mean, Dumbledore said. For Harry, yes. Hermione said, I understand exactly what it would mean. And I want to be very clear about one thing, Professor. She held his gaze directly. I will not accept that Harry has to die to resolve this. I don't care what the conventional understanding of Horcrux destruction requires. There has to be another way, and I would like your help finding it. The fire crackled. Fawkes made a low sound from his perch, something that in the context of the silence felt almost like agreement. Dumbledore looked at the 11-year-old girl across his desk, who had just disassembled his entire strategic understanding of the war with Voldemort and replaced it with something simultaneously more complete and more devastating, and said nothing for a long moment. How did you come to know all of this? He asked finally. And this time the question was not casual. It was not rhetorical. It was the real question, the one he had been building toward since the beginning of the conversation. Perhaps since the moment she had walked into McGonagall's office in October and described a pattern that an 11-year-old had no reasonable means of noticing. I read very broadly, Hermione said, and this time the line didn't work. They both knew it. The silence that followed had a different quality from the ones before, more deliberate, more focused. Something arriving at a conclusion it had been approaching for some time. Miss Granger, Dumbledore said, I am going to ask you a question, and I want you to understand that I will not be alarmed by an honest answer. In fact, I suspect the honest answer will explain a great deal. He paused. Are you operating on information that could not have been obtained through any library in Britain? The fire crackled. Hermione held very still. This was the moment she had planned for and feared in equal measure for months, since before she had even reached the sorting. Dumbledore was too intelligent, too perceptive, too experienced with impossible things to be indefinitely satisfied with an explanation that didn't fully account for what he was observing. She had hoped to delay this conversation, had hoped to establish more of the Horcrux operation before she had to explain herself, to demonstrate enough competence and accuracy that when the explanation came, it would land as confirmed rather than suspected. But he was here. The question was asked, and lying to Albus Dumbledore she had decided long ago was not a viable long-term strategy. Yes, she said. Would you be willing to tell me how? She had 3 prepared responses for this moment. The first was complete denial, which she had already ruled out. The second was partial truth, a version that gestured at time travel without specifics, implied accident rather than intention, left him with an incomplete picture he might find satisfying. The third was complete honesty, with all the vulnerability that entailed. She chose the third. I am 19 years old, she said. Mentally, I have the memories and experience of a woman who lived through the next 7 years of wizarding history, including a war that resulted in the deaths of over 50 people I knew personally. I don't know the precise mechanism of how I came to be in this body at this time, but I am here, and I have complete knowledge of what happens if nothing changes, and I have been using that knowledge since September to prevent it. The silence was very long. The diary, Dumbledore said slowly. The ring, the locket, Pettigrew, Quirrell. Yes. You knew all of it. Yes. Her voice was steady. I knew about the scar in the original timeline, and I know how it was resolved in the original timeline. But that resolution required Voldemort to resurrect himself using Harry's blood in a ritual that has not happened, and if everything proceeds correctly, never will. Without that ritual, the mechanism that allowed Harry to survive doesn't exist, which is precisely why we need to find another way. Dumbledore stood slowly and walked to the window. He stood there for nearly a full minute, looking out at the dark grounds. The winter sky beyond the glass was clear and very cold. When he turned back, his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. Something had been set down that he had been carrying for a long time. You have been carrying this alone since September, he said. You are 11 years old. Mentally, I'm 19. I've had 7 years to develop my tolerance for carrying difficult information without a reliable person to share it with. That, Dumbledore said with something in his voice she had not expected, something quiet, something that might have been sorrow, is not a skill anyone should be required to develop. He came back to the desk and sat down. He folded his hands. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that had been stripped of its usual careful management. I owe you an apology, Hermione, he said. And I believe I owe you a great deal more than that. He paused. In the future, you remember, I was planning to let Harry die. You knew about the Scar Horcrux, Hermione said. You planned to keep it secret from Harry until the appropriate moment. You orchestrated events so that he would choose to walk into death on his own without understanding whether he would survive. She met his eyes directly. It was the most calculated act of manipulation I have ever seen from someone who genuinely loved the person they were manipulating. The silence was different now, not shocked, confronted. "I am willing to believe," Dumbledore said slowly, "that in a different version of circumstances, I made choices I would deeply regret. I have made such choices before." He met her eyes. "I will not make them with you watching." "Good," Hermione said. "Then let's find another way to save Harry together." The partnership that formed between Hermione Granger and Albus Dumbledore in January of 1992 was unlike any relationship that had existed in the wizarding world in living memory, and both of them knew it. On his side, institutional authority, magical supremacy, 6 decades of accumulated knowledge spanning virtually every field of study, political connections that extended across the international wizarding community, and the particular advantage of being taken seriously without having to establish that he should be. On her side, perfect intelligence, a complete strategic map of Voldemort's Horcrux architecture. 7 years of future knowledge compressed into a mind that had always been exceptional at extracting patterns from complexity. And an uncompromising moral framework that refused to accept the acceptable losses Dumbledore had spent decades learning to live with. The tension between these contributions was productive rather than destructive. She pushed him toward solutions he had dismissed as impossible or impractical. He provided the magical resources, institutional authority, and breadth of knowledge to attempt them. She refused to let him retreat into the comfortable distance of the long game. He stopped her from moving faster than the evidence could support. They began with the objects she had identified, working through the accessible ones in order of operational simplicity. The locket came first. Sirius's exoneration had made this straightforward in ways that would have been impossible in the original timeline. In February, Dumbledore approached Sirius, still recovering at a supervised magical facility, still relearning what it felt like to occupy a body that belonged to him, and explained carefully what was needed. Sirius had hated Creature and 12 Grimold Place with the comprehensive loathing of someone for whom both had represented everything he had spent his youth trying to escape. But he had loved Regulus, in the complicated, grief-laden way of someone who had lost a younger brother to choices he hadn't been able to prevent, and had spent 15 years unable to fully understand what those choices had meant. Hermione had written out everything she knew about Regulus Black's final months, and given it to Dumbledore to pass along. Not just the fact of what Regulus had done, but the why of it, the specific courage it had taken, the understanding he had arrived at, the price he had paid for acting on it. That he had died not as a coward or a true believer, but as someone who had looked at what he had helped create and decided that he would rather die trying to end it than continue living with having contributed to it. Sirius told Creature, "The old house elf heard his beloved master Regulus's sacrifice described with the precision of truth, and something in him that had been locked in a specific configuration of grief and bitter loyalty for 12 years shifted, not broke. The word broke implied damage. This was something closer to the opposite, a release, a resolution, the satisfaction of a terrible burden finally being properly acknowledged. He brought the locket. He explained where Regulus had found it. He explained what Regulus had asked him to do, and why he had been unable to do it alone. Completing Regulus Black's final mission transformed Creature in a way that Hermione had always known was possible. She had seen the principle demonstrated in the original timeline, when Harry had treated the elf with the basic dignity of someone who understood that kindness cost nothing. It happened here earlier and more completely, with the truth of Regulus's heroism as the mechanism, and watching it happen, watching the old elf straighten slightly and seem somehow less diminished than he had been, was one of the cleaner satisfactions of this entire project. The locket was delivered to Dumbledore, destroyed with basilisk venom harvested from the Chamber of Secrets, which Dumbledore had organized through a careful retrieval operation involving parcel tongue recordings provided by researchers at the Department of Mysteries and precautions sufficient to ensure that no one was killed in the process. One down. The diadem came in March. Dumbledore accessed the room of requirement on the seventh floor, found the room of hidden things exactly as Hermione had described it. Centuries of accumulated objects, lost things and forgotten things, and things deliberately concealed, stacked and piled and balanced in configurations that had gradually developed the specific aesthetic of a junk shop run by someone with no organizing principle, and located the diadem among the debris. It was recognizable by its inscription. Wit beyond measure is man's greatest treasure, Rowena Ravenclaw's words, engraved on an object that had been used to house the very antithesis of what they celebrated. Destroyed with basilisk venom. Two down. The ring was April, and it was the operation Hermione had been most worried about, not because of the retrieval. The gaunt shack in Little Hangleton was accessible. The ring was there, and Dumbledore had both the magical ability and the authority to retrieve it without particular difficulty. She was worried about the stone. The stone in the ring is the resurrection stone, she had told him during their January meeting, choosing her words with the specific care of someone who understood exactly what she was about to say. One of the three Deathly Hallows. It can show the shades of the dead, not truly, not completely, but enough to feel like them, enough to be unbearable if you love someone you've lost. She had looked at him steadily. You will want to put it on. You will want to see Ariana. She had said this as gently as she knew how, which was not very gently because there was no gentle way to say it. If you put it on, you will die. The ring carries a withering curse tied to the stone's housing. In the future, I remember, you had a year to live from the moment you wore it. I don't want that for you. The silence that had followed this was different from the silences that came from strategic surprise or intellectual adjustment. This was the silence of grief encountered suddenly in a place where it hadn't been expected. You know about Ariana, he had said. I know enough, she had said. I know you've carried it for 60 years, and I know that what the stone would show you would look like her and not be her. I know that distinction wouldn't make it easier in the moment. I know you would put it on anyway if I didn't tell you. He had not spoken for a very long time. In April, he returned from Little Hangleton with the ring's Horcrux destroyed and the stone extracted and intact, having not worn it. He brought the stone to their next meeting and placed it on the desk between them without comment, and they both looked at it for a moment. This small, dark object that could show you the faces of everyone you had lost, and then Hermione said, "What do you want to do with it?" And Dumbledore said, "Keep it somewhere it cannot be easily found," and they moved on. Three down. The diary was the most politically complicated of the spring operations, because it required moving against Lucius Malfoy without the kind of evidence that could support a direct accusation. We need it before he uses it, Hermione told Dumbledore. In the original timeline, he gave it to Ginny Weasley in second year. It possessed her, used her as a vessel to open the Chamber of Secrets. Students were petrified. A 12-year-old girl spent most of second year under the influence of Tom Riddle's 17-year-old memory. She paused. Harry had to kill the basilisk to save her. I would prefer to avoid all of that. You're suggesting we retrieve the diary from Malfoy Manor before it can be deployed, Dumbledore said. I'm suggesting, Hermione said carefully, that a legal search of Malfoy property for dark artifacts, triggered by Pettigrew's Veritaserum testimony, in which he named Lucius Malfoy as a Death Eater supporter, would give the Ministry grounds to conduct exactly that search. The Malfoys claim they acted under Imperius. That claim can be neither proven nor disproven without evidence. But the Ministry has clear authority to search the property of anyone named by a confessed Death Eater. You have thought about this in considerable detail, Dumbledore observed. I know it works, she said. I just need your help making the political connections. The Ministry's search of Malfoy Manor was authorized in May of 1992. Several dark objects were confiscated in the course of the search. Among them was a small black diary. TM. Riddle, 1943, embossed on the cover, delivered to Dumbledore's custody by Ministry confiscation order. Destroyed with basilisk venom that same afternoon. 4. Down. By June of 1992, the end of Hermione's first year at Hogwarts, 4 Horcruxes had been destroyed: the locket, the diadem, the ring, and the diary. The cup remained in the Lestrange vault at Gringotts, requiring a more complex approach that she hadn't yet finalized, and Harry's scar remained unsolved. The problem she and Dumbledore had begun working on, in every meeting, approaching from new angles each time, neither of them willing to stop until they found a path that didn't require a boy to walk knowingly toward his own death. Voldemort's wraith was in Albania, growing weaker without anchors to sustain it, without servants to assist it, without the infrastructure of immortality it had spent decades constructing. The war, she remembered, was becoming something that might not happen at all. Hermione sat on the Hogwarts Express going south at the end of term, watching the Scottish Highlands give way to softer countryside, and allowed herself to think about what had been accomplished. Pettigrew exposed, Sirius free, Quirrell neutralized, 4 Horcruxes destroyed. Dumbledore, alive and fully informed, with no ring on his hand and no countdown running. Harry spending his first Christmas with a godfather who loved him, rather than in a cupboard under the stairs. She thought about Fred Weasley, who was somewhere on this train laughing with his twin. She thought about Remus Lupin, who was no longer quite so isolated. She thought about Dobby, still enslaved, still a problem she hadn't solved yet. She took out the parchment she had written on the first day, the must-save registry, and looked at it for a long moment. Then she put it back in her pocket and pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window and let herself, just for a moment, feel the particular weight of being the only person alive who understood what all of this had cost the first time around. The Hufflepuff Cup required a different kind of approach entirely. Hermione explained this to Dumbledore in their first meeting after summer began, sitting in his Hogwarts office, with sunlight falling through the tower windows in the particular golden way of June. A break-in would create political consequences we can't afford, she said. The goblins would view unauthorized access to their vaults as an act of war against their sovereignty. Even if we succeeded, we would permanently damage any future cooperation between wizards and goblins at exactly the moment when broader cooperation serves everyone's interests. You have an alternative, Dumbledore said. Not a question. Bill Weasley is a curse-breaker for Gringotts, Hermione said. He has established trust with the goblin community that took years to build. More importantly, we have legitimate legal leverage. Bellatrix Lestrange is a convicted Death Eater serving a life sentence. Her vault contains dark artifacts. We know this because Pettigrew's Veritaserum testimony referenced Voldemort storing important objects with his most trusted followers. The Ministry has authority to address dangerous dark objects in the vaults of convicted Death Eaters, but the goblins will resist any approach that frames this as compulsory. So we don't frame it as compulsory, Dumbledore said slowly, following the logic. We negotiate. The goblins don't want dark artifacts in their bank. Those objects are dangerous liabilities, not assets. We offer them a cooperative framework. The Ministry formally requests Goblin assistance in identifying and removing dark artifacts from Death Eater vaults, with full Goblin oversight of the process. They maintain their sovereignty. They control the methodology. They choose who participates. And in exchange, the Ministry gets access to the cup. The Goblins will negotiate hard, Dumbledore said. Yes, Hermione agreed. Let them. Give them everything they ask for in terms of process and control. The only thing that matters is the outcome. The operation took 2 months to arrange. Dumbledore approached the Ministry through proper channels, framing it as a cooperative effort between the Department of Magical Law Enforcement and Gringotts to address dark artifacts that posed security risks to both communities. Minister Fudge, who had learned through the Sirius Black exoneration that trusting Dumbledore's counsel tended to produce politically favorable outcomes, agreed to the framework. The goblins negotiated exactly as predicted, with the particular thoroughness of a community that had been outmaneuvered by wizards too many times to accept anything at face value. They wanted full control over which vaults were searched. They wanted wizarding oversight minimized. They wanted formal written acknowledgement that this arrangement was cooperative rather than compelled. Dumbledore, working with Arthur Weasley from the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts office, who was, as Hermione had assessed, exactly the kind of principled and genuinely decent person who could be trusted with the political delicacy the situation required, structured the agreement to satisfy every goblin condition in exchange for access to 3 specific vaults, including the Lestrange Vault. Bill Weasley was assigned as the wizarding cursebreaker on the operation. The search happened in August, with Bill working alongside goblin cursebreakers and ministry observers in a configuration designed to ensure that no one felt their authority was being superseded. The cup was identified among Bellatrix's possessions, removed under controlled conditions, and delivered to Dumbledore's custody within 24 hours. Destroyed with basilisk venom that same evening. 5 Horcruxes destroyed. Only the scar remained. Hermione's second year at Hogwarts was, in the most surreal way possible, ordinary. There was no diary possession. There was no basilisk terrorizing the school. There was no series of petrifications, no messages written in blood on corridor walls, no widespread fear about the heir of Slytherin. The Chamber of Secrets remained sealed, and the basilisk slept undisturbed in the depths below the school, a dangerous remnant of Salazar Slytherin's particular vision for what Hogwarts should be, but a contained one. Gilderoy Lockhart never came to Hogwarts at all. He was still traveling and fabricating his adventures elsewhere, never receiving the professorial appointment that would have exposed his fraud and cost him his memory. The defense position was filled by a competent substitute who taught actual defensive magic and had no elaborate self-promotional enterprise to maintain. Classes were productive and occasionally genuinely interesting. For the first time since arriving in September of 1991, Hermione attended a school year in which she did not already know every crisis that was approaching. She did homework. She studied for exams. She spent Thursday afternoons in the library researching the scar problem with the focused intensity of someone who understood that this was, ultimately, the only thing that mattered. She scored the highest marks in every class she sat, without apparent effort, because the effort had been done 7 years ago, and the knowledge was simply there. Harry spent Christmas with Sirius in the cottage in the countryside Sirius had bought after his release, a small, slightly crooked building in a part of England where no one knew who either of them were, and came back to Hogwarts in January with the specific glow of a child who had experienced, perhaps for the first time, what it felt like to be someone's unconditional first priority. He told Hermione and Ron about it in fragments over the first week back. Sirius teaching him to fly properly, not just adequately, but really, with the attention of someone who had loved Quidditch and wanted to share it. Cooking meals together, the domestic ordinariness of it, apparently as significant as the extraordinary parts. Long conversations about James and Lily that Harry had never been able to have with anyone else, because the people who had loved his parents most had either been absent or too careful of his feelings to say everything they remembered. "He knew my dad," Harry said one evening in the common room, his voice carrying a particular quality of wonder, not excitement, something quieter and more durable than excitement. Not the story of him. Actually knew him. He has stories about him being annoying, about the stupid things he said sometimes, about how he and my mum argued before they actually got together properly. He paused. It makes him feel real. Hermione watched him and thought about the alternative. The timeline where Sirius had spent another year in Azkaban, emerging gaunt and haunted in third year. Where, Harry's only access to his parents had come through fragments and guilty half-truths from people who felt responsible for surviving. "I'm glad," she said, and meant it completely, without qualification. Ron's second year was also different. Without the diary crisis, Ginny didn't suffer the trauma of possession and near death. She was a normal first year, nervous in the way of someone starting something significant, enthusiastic about most of her classes, occasionally writing Ron letters that told him to stop embarrassing her in front of his friends with great sincerity. Ron complained about this with the specific exasperation of someone who was genuinely fond of his sister rather than terrified for her life, which was, Hermione reflected, exactly as it should be. Through all of it, she and Dumbledore met every 2 weeks. The scar problem was the only thing they could not solve, and it was not from lack of effort. The problem was deceptively simple to state. How do you destroy a Horcrux that is embedded in a living human being without killing the human? Every conventional destruction method required destroying the container beyond magical repair. Basilisk venom dissolved objects at the molecular level. Fiend fire incinerated them to ash. The sword of Gryffindor, imbued with basilisk venom, required driving it through the container. These methods worked perfectly for objects. For a living host, they meant death. The mechanism that had worked in the original timeline required 3 conditions that would not exist here. Without Voldemort's resurrection, the blood tether never formed. Without the blood tether, the ancient protection that had meant Harry could not die while Voldemort lived didn't exist. The mechanism that had allowed him to walk into the killing curse and walk back out again was gone. They approached the problem from every angle simultaneously. The magical theory angle. Dumbledore consulted every text on soul magic in the Hogwarts library, including several from his private collection that predated the school itself. The consistent scholarly conclusion was that soul fragments attached to living hosts could not be separated without killing the host. The soul and the body were too fundamentally intertwined. The foreign fragment, over time, became incorporated into the host's own magical signature in ways that made surgical separation theoretically impossible. But theoretically impossible and actually impossible were different categories, and Hermione had spent years learning to treat the former as a challenge rather than a conclusion. The healing magic angle. Madame Pomfrey was consulted discreetly, without revealing the full context. Her expertise in magical healing was genuinely unmatched within the school, but her assessment was honest and not encouraging. A foreign magical entity embedded at the soul level couldn't be treated as an injury to the body. She had no framework, no tools, no precedent. The charms angle produced the first genuinely new idea. Professor Flitwick was brought into the conversation in December of second year, after careful vetting, at Hermione's specific suggestion. His half-goblin heritage gave him access to magical traditions that purely wizarding scholarship didn't encompass, and the goblin magical perspective focused on the properties of objects and their relationships to their creators and owners, offered a framework that soul magic texts didn't. A Horcrux is, at its structural core, an object with a specific magical relationship to its creator, Flitwick said. After they had explained the situation to him, with the careful precision of people who understood the weight of what they were asking him to hold. "We've been approaching this as a problem of destruction. How do we destroy the fragment?" But goblin magical theory would ask a different question. What if we severed the relationship rather than destroying the container? The silence that followed this was the particular silence of an idea that changed the shape of everything that had been said before it. If we could cut the connection between Voldemort's soul fragment and Harry's living soul, Flitwick continued, without damaging Harry himself, the fragment, severed from both its origin and its host, would be isolated, vulnerable, potentially destroyable by conventional means without conventional means touching Harry at all. "The severance charm," Dumbledore said slowly. "It would be extremely complex magic. Nothing like this has been attempted in recorded wizarding history." Flitwick looked at Hermione, who was already thinking 3 steps ahead. But the theoretical foundation exists in goblin magical tradition. The principle of severing magical bonds without damaging the bonded parties. It would require significant refinement. Then we refine it, Hermione said. In September of third year, Dumbledore made the decision to bring Severus Snape into the project. Hermione had anticipated this and had prepared for it accordingly, which didn't make the prospect any less complicated. She knew Snape's true allegiance with a completeness that most people would have found difficult to credit. She had read his memories in the original timeline, standing in a stone bowl in a dead man's office, watching the whole devastatingly private story of a man who had loved one person completely and spent the rest of his life trying to protect her son out of guilt and grief, and something that refused to be reduced to either of those things. She respected him enormously. She also knew he would be difficult. The conversation happened in Dumbledore's office on a Thursday evening, with Hermione present at her own insistence. "You're telling me," Snape said, his voice carrying the particular quiet that in him indicated the opposite of calm, "that the boy has been carrying a fragment of the Dark Lord's soul in his scar for 12 years. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "And you knew this." "I suspected it for some time. Miss Granger confirmed it." Snape's eyes moved to Hermione, with the assessment of someone rapidly recalibrating. He had been teaching her for 2 years. She was his top student in potions, which he considered the most demanding and intellectually rigorous discipline in the curriculum. And she had met every challenge he had set with the infuriating capability of someone who genuinely understood what she was doing, rather than merely following instructions. He had respected her in the abstract. He was beginning to understand that abstract respect was insufficient for the situation. "How exactly did you confirm something that the most powerful wizards alive had been unable to verify?" he asked. "I read very broadly," Hermione said. "This is not a matter for levity," Snape said sharply. "No," she agreed, "it isn't. That's why we need your help." She laid out what they had: Flitwick's severance charm theory, Madame Pomfrey's assessment of the medical constraints, the complete absence of historical precedent for any of it working. Snape listened with the focused attention of someone who was already thinking about solutions before the problem was fully described. "A potion," he said, when they had finished. Dumbledore raised an eyebrow. "There's a specific potion that could assist with this?" "Not an existing one." Snape stood and began moving with the particular restlessness of a mind working faster than physical stillness could accommodate. "There is a theoretical variant of the draught of living death, never successfully brewed, discussed in Paracelsus's 16th century writings, that targets the soul rather than the body. The principle is creating a state where soul and body temporarily separate without severing the permanent connection between them. A controlled, reversible partial death. The soul remains tethered to the body but exists in a liminal space. And in that space," Dumbledore said slowly, following the logic, "a foreign soul fragment in that state would be, theoretically, exposed, separated from the host's own soul, which is retreated into the liminal space, no longer protected by the host's living magical signature." Snape looked at Flitwick. "If your severance charm were applied at precisely that moment, the fragment would be isolated," Flitwick said. "Vulnerable, and then destroyed with basilisk venom," Snape concluded, "while Fawkes's tears prevent the venom from reaching the host." The room was quiet. "4 types of magic," Hermione said, working through it. "Soul magic, goblin charm work, potion-induced stasis, phoenix healing, none of which have ever been used in combination. The margin for error would be significant," Flitwick said carefully. "Which is why we don't attempt it on Harry until we've tested it extensively and are absolutely certain it will work," Hermione said. "We test on constructed Horcruxes first. We test every element independently. We test them in combination. We only proceed when the failure rate is as close to zero as we can get it. She looked around the room at three of the most capable magical practitioners alive. And then we ask Harry's consent, not before. When did you become the person making these decisions? Snape asked. There was something in the question that wasn't hostility, something closer to reluctant acknowledgement. When I was the only person in the room who had already watched him die once, Hermione said quietly. I'm not watching it happen again. Third year moved in two parallel tracks, the visible one and the invisible one. The visible track was Hogwarts in 1993. Classes, exams, Hogsmeade visits, the first of them accompanied by the particular excitement of 13-year-olds experiencing unsupervised access to a village full of things designed to appeal to 13-year-olds. Remus Lupin had been appointed as defense against the dark arts professor at Dumbledore's specific invitation, with full knowledge of his condition and full commitment to supporting him in managing it. And he was, as Hermione had always known and deeply appreciated, exactly as gifted a teacher as his instincts suggested. His students loved him within the first 3 weeks. She watched Harry's relationship with him develop with the quiet satisfaction of someone watching a thing happen correctly that had previously gone so terribly wrong. Ron developed a crush on a Ravenclaw girl and handled the situation with all the grace and subtlety available to a 13-year-old boy, which was to say approximately none. The girl was aware of his interest. The girl was also considerably better at maintaining composure about it than Ron was. Hermione watched this unfold with the fond exasperation of someone who remembered how the Yule Ball disaster in fourth year had introduced Ron to the concept of his own feelings like a poorly timed ambush, and who was quietly relieved that no Yule Ball existed in this timeline to facilitate an equivalent catastrophe. The invisible track was Snape's laboratory in Dumbledore's office, where the most complex magical project in living memory was being assembled piece by careful piece. Snape spent 6 months on the Soul Sleep draft. The first 17 iterations failed in ways ranging from inert to actively dangerous. The 18th produced something that resembled what they needed, a suspended state in which the test subject's body remained alive, while magical scans showed a loosening of the soul's attachment to the physical form, not complete separation, a controlled relaxation of the bond, a window. Flitwick refined the severance charm through the same period, working first on objects, small Horcrux analogues constructed for the purpose, dark magic applied to chosen containers under controlled conditions. Could he sever the magical relationship between a dark object and its creator without destroying the object itself? After months of work, the answer was yes. The charm could cut the tether with precision, leaving both container and fragment intact but disconnected, isolated. By March of third year, they had a theoretical protocol. By May, they had tested it successfully on a constructed Horcrux, an object deliberately imbued with a voluntary soul fragment by someone from the Department of Mysteries who was terminally ill and wished to contribute something meaningful with the time they had left. The object was placed in the soul sleep state. The severance charm was applied. The isolated fragment was destroyed with basilisk venom. Fawkes's tears were administered to the object immediately after. The object survived intact. The protocol worked. In June of third year, at the end of examinations, Hermione and Dumbledore sat Harry Potter down in the headmaster's office and told him everything. Hermione had thought about this conversation for nearly 2 years. She had run through versions of it in her mind during the quiet hours, had considered and discarded a dozen different approaches, had argued with herself about timing and framing and how much to explain versus how much to simply state. She had arrived at the conclusion that Harry deserved the truth in full, without management or strategic omission, and that telling him when there was a working solution was infinitely better than telling him when there wasn't one. Dumbledore did not start with small talk. Harry, we need to tell you something about the night your parents died, about what happened when the killing curse rebounded, and about the scar on your forehead. What followed was the most honest conversation Harry Potter had ever had with an adult in a position of authority. Dumbledore explained Horcruxes, what they were, how they worked, what Voldemort had done to anchor himself to life through murder and soul-splitting. He explained that the night the killing curse had rebounded in Godric's Hollow, a fragment of Voldemort's already fractured soul had attached itself to the nearest living thing, a one-year-old boy in a cot. Harry listened with the particular quality of stillness that Hermione recognized as him processing something that was going to fundamentally change his understanding of himself. Not shock. He had always been able to absorb difficult information, something more considered than shock. "There's a piece of Voldemort inside me," he said finally. "In my scar." "Yes," Dumbledore said. "That's why I can speak Parseltongue, why I have the dreams, why I feel—" He stopped. "The connection," Hermione said gently. "Yes, the soul fragment creates a link between you. It's not you, Harry. It's the thing inside you. You are not Voldemort. You never were." Harry looked at her. Something in his expression that she had seen before on his face and recognized immediately. The assessment of someone checking whether they were being told a partial truth. "How long have you known?" "Since before first year," Hermione said. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you sooner. We needed to be certain we had a way to fix it before we told you it existed. I didn't want you carrying this without a solution already in reach. Can you fix it?" His voice was very quiet. The voice of someone asking a question they are genuinely uncertain about the answer to. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "We have developed a procedure. It has been tested extensively. There are risks. We cannot tell you honestly that there are no risks, because that would not be true. But we believe they are manageable. If you consent to undergo it, we can remove the Horcrux without harming you. Whenever you're ready," Hermione added. "This is your choice, Harry. Completely. We won't proceed without your informed, willing consent." This was the critical difference from the original timeline. In that version, Harry had learned about the Horcrux in his final year, in the middle of an active war, with no time to process what he'd been told, and no choice available to him except to walk into the Forbidden Forest and hope for the best. He had not been asked. He had been informed, and then left alone with the weight of it. Here he was, 13. He was surrounded by people who loved him. He was being asked, "What happens if I say no?" Harry said. "Then we wait," Hermione said. "We keep researching. We find another approach, or we wait until you're ready. This is not urgent in the way it would be if Voldemort had a body. He's a wraith without Horcruxes. He grows weaker, not stronger. We have time." "But you want to do it. I want you free of this thing," Hermione said. "I want the connection gone. I want the dreams to stop. I want you to be just yourself, without anything of his inside you." She met his eyes directly. "But I want you alive more. And I want it to be your decision." Harry was quiet for a long time. Then, "If it works, if you remove it, I won't have the connection anymore. The parcel tongue will go. The dreams." "Correct," Dumbledore said. "And Voldemort will have one less anchor to existence." "Also correct." Harry nodded slowly, the nod of someone who has finished working through a thing and arrived at a conclusion. "Then I want to do it," he said. "Not because I'm being noble. Because I don't want this thing inside me. And because—" He looked at Hermione, then at Dumbledore. "Because I trust you, both of you." "Are you certain?" Hermione asked. "I'm certain," Harry said. "When do we start?"